It's day 2 of our instrument procedures course launch, and today we're going to talk about workload management. As I said before, I think this is one of the most important skills that a pilot can have, instrument or VFR. But I also think it is one of the most underemphasized. And that's just simply because we spend so long focusing on the very important but also very basic skills, like flight by reference to instruments, navigation, loading and understanding the basic procedures. We don't always spend a lot of time talking about how we can structure what we do, our configuration, our thought patterns, how we load procedures, and what we ask air traffic control for so that it minimizes our workload. And the biggest challenge, I would say, is that when that workload gets too high, then eventually we run out of capacity on our basic skills. We overtax them. And that's when you do things like fail a Checkride or end up with a pilot deviation, or worse. So the first thing I always say is think about how we're managing our workload when you're making decisions, configuration decisions, how you're setting up flight plans, or how you're setting up your avionics, how you're setting up your PFD display, or what you're asking for from air traffic control. What you want to do is think about how that affects your workload and how you can keep that workload to the absolute minimum. And then that way, if something does start to happen to raise that workload, you have tons of capacity to make up for it. And to manage that workload, I use a couple different techniques. One of the biggest ones is structured configuration points, essentially gates that I'm flying through on an instrument approach procedure, and I need to meet certain criteria: speed, configuration, autopilot configuration, as I go through those gates. They're structured so that as I fly through that procedure, the flying is easy. It doesn't take a lot of effort. That's the key. You want to keep things as simple as possible. So we'll start by talking about that. And then after that, I'm going to talk about how I set up my RNAV flight plan, how I'm using my avionics to support me on the approach. And the example approach we're going to fly today is the ILS to runway 11 in San Luis Obispo, California. Now, today we're going to talk about this looking at the chart, and then in the next video, we're going to go out there and actually fly it. But I think you'll be able to link the two together, and no matter where you are in your instrument training, whether you're certified or training, or just thinking about it, you'll be able to take some things away from this. Okay, so let's start by talking about those configuration points. If you've taken Mastering Takeoffs and Landings, or you've watched any of my videos where I talk about landings and traffic patterns, you'll know that I think that configuration is essential because in the airplane, they really do behave essentially as expected. Power settings and configurations give us expected conditions, expected speeds in level flight, or expected descent rates at a certain airspeed. And as we're flying along an instrument approach procedure, we essentially want to put ourselves in a position where we can just use expected settings to get expected speeds and outcomes as we move our way along the procedure. And then we're just fine-tuning the adjustments from there. So there are really 3 specific points that I'm looking at on an instrument approach procedure. The first one occurs as I'm transitioning onto the approach. The second one occurs right before my final approach fix. And then the third configuration point for me occurs as I begin my missed approach. So let's take a look at that first point. To make things simple, we'll start assuming we're beginning the procedure at an initial approach fix. So I always want to cross that initial approach fix at a specific speed and a specific flap configuration. In the Cirrus SR22 Turbo, I always cross it at 120 knots indicated with my flaps clean. So in level flight, I know that that's going to take me about 51% power. If you're flying a Bonanza, or if you're flying a Turbo 182, something where you have manifold pressure, all you need to do is figure out what that manifold pressure is at your RPM setting for the speed you want as you cross that fix. Write that down, and now you know what to set to get you very, very close. Now, 120 knots works very well for us because it keeps us moving along the procedure fairly quickly, but it's also very easy to slow from 120 knots to our final approach configuration of 100 knots by basically making a small power change and a single flap change. But I'll talk about that more in a second. So as I said, I would like to cross my initial approach fix at 120 knots, flaps clean. That generally means that I'm going to start slowing to that 120 knots when I'm within about 2 to 3 minutes of my initial approach fix, which also matches when I'm going to slow to my holding speed if I'm flying a holding pattern. Oftentimes I'm getting vectored onto the final approach, and that's what I'm expecting here in San Luis Obispo. And in that case, I will slow to my initial approach speed, generally around my base vector. And that's simply because oftentimes we've found air traffic control starts vectoring us for the approach when we're still 30 or 40 miles away. And so I don't want to fly that entire distance at a slow speed of 120 knots. So I'll typically wait till I'm at my base vector, or if they haven't given me it yet, when I'm within roughly 15 miles of the approach itself. That gives me enough time to get the aircraft slowed down and stabilized at 120 knots. Now, my next configuration point happens right in front of my final approach fix. And we're going to look at this in two different conditions. Condition 1 is when I'm using vertical guidance. And condition 2 is when I'm not, when I'm descending down to an MDA without guidance in the airplane. So when I'm using vertical guidance, that could be a glide slope off of an ILS, that could be a glide path off of an LPV, or an LNAV, VNAV driven RNAV procedure, or it could be advisory vertical guidance that I'm using on a non-precision approach. Advisory vertical guidance isn't certified. It's not actually part of the procedure, but I'm still using it to guide my descent down the final approach segment. And so because of that, because I'm essentially flying that glide path as part of my final approach segment, I configure all of those vertically guided procedures the exact same way. And for me, that means that I am going to slow to my final approach speed of 100 knots, and I'm going to set my final approach flap configuration of 50% flaps when my glide slope or glide path reaches 1/2 scale deflection. I found for me, that gives me the right amount of time to slow from 120 knots down to 100 knots in level flight, and then intercept my glide slope, make another power adjustment, and I can fly that right down the final approach segment. It works out fantastic. If you're flying a faster aircraft, you may find that you want to start that configuration change right when your glide slope or your glide path comes off of full scale deflection. And if you're flying a slower aircraft, you may find that you want to wait maybe a little later till it's about a quarter scale away from centering up. But the key thing is find the point that works for you and then use that every single time. Now for me in the Cirrus, I know that to make that configuration change, I'm going to do two things. So I see that glide slope or glide path reach 1/2 scale deflection. I'm going to bring my power back to 41%, and then I'm going to set flaps to 50%, which is my intermediate flap setting. Now, if you fly a Cirrus, this number may also be very familiar to you because it is also your downwind power setting that gets you to 100 knots indicated on your downwind leg of a traffic pattern when you have flaps set to 50%. No matter what aircraft you're flying, many people are flying their final approach segment at either 100 knots or 90 knots. So if you're trying to figure out, well, how would I configure that? Think about when you're flying 100 knots or 90 knots in level flight and what configuration do you use? That's a fantastic configuration to use for your final approach point. That's the beauty of an instrument approach. It is different than flying a visual traffic pattern, but we're still flying the same speeds, and the aircraft, even though we're flying it by reference to instruments, it still behaves the same way. The aerodynamics are the same. So you can use your knowledge of how to configure the aircraft visually to help you choose the right configuration for your final approach segment. Okay, another question that we do get a lot about workload is, if I'm intercepting the glide path or the glide slope before the actual published glide path or glide slope intercept point, then do you configure your final approach speed there? So for example, you may end up intercepting that glide slope or glide path well out on the intermediate segment if air traffic control assigns you a high altitude restriction until you got established on the localizer. That's not uncommon. And in that case, I will make my configuration change, again, when that glide slope or glide path reaches 1/2 scale deflection. And now I'm flying part of my intermediate segment, essentially in my final approach configuration. Why am I doing that? Because I'm essentially flying my final approach descent. I'm just starting it from a higher altitude and starting it early. Now our actual final approach fixed point doesn't change. It's when we cross through that published glide slope intercept altitude. But I make that configuration as I'm intercepting my glide path or glide slope. And that's what I'm going to do on our flight into San Luis Obispo. Non-precision approaches without vertical guidance are honestly getting a little bit rare, but we do fly them. And I'm going to configure a little differently simply because we don't have that glide path or glide slope to watch. So in that case, I'm going to slow my aircraft to the same final approach configuration. For us, 100 knots and flaps 50% when I'm within 2 miles of my final approach fix. So essentially, thinking time-wise, I'm flying 120 knots on that intermediate segment. That gives me 1 minute to slow down my aircraft from 120 knots to 100 knots and stabilize it before I cross my final approach fix. And for us, that 1 minute works very well. From there, I am not going to change my final approach configuration as I fly down the final approach segment, both for non-precision without vertical guidance and for any vertically guided procedure. I leave my configuration set. And then if I continue to land, I'm going to keep my flap configuration all the way down to landing. Now, some of you are thinking, okay, that means that you're only landing with 50% flaps. In the Cirrus, most people land with 100% flaps on a visual landing. And you're right, I'm going to make a partial flap landing. But again, my goal is to keep my workload at an absolute minimum and to fly a stabilized approach. And when you add flaps at a low altitude, you're increasing your workload and you're destabilizing your approach. You have a pitch change, you have a power change, you have a drag change. And why do you do it? What's the advantage? Well, part of it is because many of us don't really get a chance to practice, or we don't practice partial flap landings. So we kind of get stuck on that full flap or normal flap landing, even though partial flaps in light aircraft is a completely normal landing, so it feels uncomfortable to us. So one of the things I tell people is go out there and practice partial flap landings in the visual world so you're incredibly comfortable with them. Then when you're flying an ILS or an LPV, you're landing with your flaps in a partial flap setting, it feels natural and normal. Something that kind of surprises people, and if you're getting ready for your instrument check ride, this may surprise you, but if you ask a lot of designated pilot examiners who has the worst landings on a check ride, it's not private pilot candidates. It's instrument pilot candidates. Think about this. What do you do all the time? You fly the approach to the mist, fly the approach to the mist, fly the approach to the mist, and then you maybe land once. So practice landings on your instrument approaches. Oftentimes, honestly, I like to fly them down to, if the runway's long enough, a touch and go, and then start the missed approach segment after that. It gives me the opportunity to dial in that landing. And if you're getting ready for your instrument check ride, don't forget about the landings. The other thing that I will tell you is don't change anything up. When we get an email about why someone fails a check ride, so often it is, I used to land like this, but then I decided for some reason to land in a different configuration. And then everything tends to go out the window. That's why, as I said, I follow the configurations that I've planned and I fly them time after time after time. It makes me very good at them and I know exactly what to expect in the airplane. Okay, now let's talk about my missed approach configuration. The funny thing about a missed approach is, to a student working on your instrument rating, if you're an instrument candidate, you fly missed approaches all the time. You're like a missed approach expert. If I was to fly with anybody who has to execute a missed approach, it would be an instrument candidate because they do them all the time. Those of us who are instrument rated, honestly, we do them so rarely that when they do happen in the real IFR world, it's completely abnormal. People feel completely out of the water. So I always think about my configuration and my actions on my missed approach segment when I'm looking at an instrument approach procedure. So if I'm flying my final approach segment and our aircraft at 100 knots indicated with flaps 50, and I need to transition to a missed approach, I'm going to transition initially to VY 103 in our cirrus, and then I will climb at Vy with my flaps still at 50% until I've cleared any close-in obstacles, and then I will retract my flaps and transition to a cruise climb once my cruise climb meets the climb gradient requirements for the procedure. Remember, your standard climb gradient on a missed approach procedure is 200 feet per nautical mile unless the notes or instructions say otherwise. Okay, so I think about how I'm going to do that. I think about the pitch attitude that's going to require, which for us is about 7 to 10 degrees. I think about what I'm looking for in the airplane and what it's going to sound like. And then I think about the actions I'm going to take as I retract my flaps from 50% to 0. A lot of people ask, why don't I pull my flaps up right away? And the answer is, as the flaps are retracting, you're going to sink a little bit. And so for that initial segment, as I execute the missed approach, as I start my climb, I like to wait till I've cleared anything close in so I don't end up sinking down on them. The other thing to consider is if you start moving things all at the same time, you are increasing your workload. That's also why I don't use full flaps on final approach on an instrument approach, because it's very difficult for us to climb with full flaps. Okay, now let's talk about a different kind of configuration, and that is autopilot configuration. I always plan on where I'm going to set up my autopilot modes and where I'm going to switch from my autopilot to my flight director. And when I'm flying a procedure, I don't care whether I want to hand fly the full thing or not. I always have my auto flight system completely set up. Now, many of you are learning without auto flight systems right now, but eventually you will have them. And as you get into larger and larger aircraft, it becomes a corporate requirement to have those auto flight systems set up properly for each phase of flight, even if you're hand flying with your flight director. The flight director, you're just simply following the command bars. Essentially, the autopilot computer tells you where to go, and you do it. When you engage the autopilot, all you're doing is turning on the servos, and now the servos are following those flight director bars as well. So on the ILS to runway 11 in San Luis Obispo, they do have a note that says that I cannot fly an autopilot coupled approach below 677 feet MSL. So in this case, I may plan on using my autopilot coupled until I'm at a certain point on my instrument approach, and then I will switch over to flight director. Where I do that, I think about, I plan, and I brief. And I always choose a point where the aircraft is stable. It doesn't necessarily need to be level, but it is in a steady flight condition, either stably descending or in level flight, and we're not going through a configuration change. I don't switch from autopilot to flight director as I'm capturing a glide slope or as I'm crossing a fix. And the reason for that is that increases my workload. Autopilots are fantastic workload management tools, but when you use them wrong, then they just increase your workload. Okay, we've talked about speed and configuration. We've talked about some basic autopilot planning. Now let's talk about how we're going to set up our avionics for the procedure. And in today's flying world, we're basically using a hybrid combination of RNAV navigation, powered by GPS, combined with some final approach guidance, sometimes from a conventional nav aid, like an ILS, a localizer, or a localizer and a glide slope. And it brings up what I would say is the biggest question we get when it comes to setting up a procedure in your flight plan, and that is, should you load the procedure or should you activate the procedure? So one of the things to consider is, I would say as a general rule, we always want to load a procedure, because when we activate a procedure, that means that we are going to go direct to the first waypoint on that procedure, the first waypoint that appears in the flight plan under that procedure, which means that if we're currently navigating an airway or proceeding direct to a fix assigned by air traffic control, and I hit activate on my instrument approach procedure, it's going to change where I'm actively navigating to and switch to navigate to the first point on that procedure itself, oftentimes the initial approach fix. The next question that we get a lot is, should I load a vector to final when I'm expecting vectors to the final approach course? Or should I load the entire procedure starting an initial approach fix? And even when I know that I'm going to get vectors to the final approach course, I always load the procedure starting at the initial approach fix. And I choose the one that is the most appropriate to my route of flight. So you'll see that as we look at the ILS into San Luis Obispo, we're coming from Salinas. We're going to fly over the Paso Robles VOR along the Victor Airway. So I choose the feeder route that starts over Paso Robles when I load the procedure, even when I know I'm going to get vectors to final. And the reason is this. Oftentimes air traffic control will give me a vector, but then to get me going in a general direction, they will send me direct to a fix on the procedure. In this case, something like creep. If I've loaded the vector to final procedure, that fix is no longer in my flight plan. So I need to tell air traffic control that I am unable to go to that fix. Otherwise, I would have to reload the procedure, which is not something that I want to do, as I'm close in. So by loading the entire procedure, I give myself the option to navigate to the different fixes if air traffic control sends me there. The other thing that I've seen happen is all of a sudden the weather goes below minimums, or something happens at the airport where they need me to wait. Normally, I get a box vector. But if the weather really drops, which is not unheard of when we're talking about the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, then I may want to fly a holding pattern. And look, there's a holding pattern right here over a creep. So having that loaded into my flight plan means that if I need to take a holding pattern to delay, I've already got the fix in there, and all I need to do is program a hold at the waypoint, minimizing my workload. If you always load your instrument approach procedure from the initial approach fix into your flight plan, you give yourself the most options. And if you're getting ready for your instrument checkride, the examiner will really appreciate seeing you do it. Now here's the next thing. You know you're getting vectors to the final approach course on an ILS. Maybe you don't really need RNAV because the procedure doesn't require distance. Why bother loading it at all? Think about that missed approach procedure. If you execute the missed approach procedure, you're already in a high workload environment. And now, as you maneuver along that missed approach procedure, you're trying to use conventional nav aids because it's not in your RNAV flight plan, which means you're doing a lot of dialing and twisting, which is the way I originally learned how to fly these procedures, and it was a high workload environment. But when you have the entire instrument approach procedure loaded into your RNAV flight plan, and you end up executing a missed approach procedure, then once you navigate off of that localizer course, you can switch back to RNAV navigation. And again, that lowers your workload. So if you take only a few things away from this video, it's number one, always think about how you can lower your workload. Number two, choose your configuration points. Know them. Know exactly what speed, what power setting, what flap configuration you want. If you cross that point and you are not configured, execute a missed approach. How would you execute a missed approach on the initial approach segment? Simple. Just don't descend. Continue flying the procedure laterally. Some procedures occasionally have a mandatory altitude, so you would need to comply with that or an at or below altitude, but don't continue descending all the way down to your minimum altitude. Simply level out, continue flying the lateral procedure, and tell air traffic control that you need to set up for the procedure again. This isn't always your fault. I've seen air traffic control leave people high. Oftentimes they're really just trying to help. They give you a short vector onto the procedure, and you just can't get down fast enough. And there's no way to fix it. So if you don't make it through that gate in your speed and configuration and at the altitude that you want to be, call for a missed approach and set up again. And then the next thing I would say to take away from this is load the procedure into your RNAV flight plan, even if you know you're only probably going to need the conventional navigation aids. Like you're getting vectored onto the final approach course for an ILS that doesn't require any distance information. Because number one, it makes it easier to visualize your position along the procedure. But number two, if you need to execute the missed approach, which is almost always unexpected in the real world, you've got something that can lower your workload. Okay, I'd like to leave you with a couple questions here before we go on to the next video where we're actually going to fly the ILS runway 11 in San Luis Obispo. And that is, what are your configuration points on an instrument approach procedure in your airplane? What power settings, what manifold pressure setting and RPM setting, what flap configurations and speeds are you looking for, and where are you setting them? And I've got a link to the PDF page where you can write all this down so you got a visual representation of those configurations and speeds down below. If you're ready to jump into the instrument procedures course, I've got a link below so that you can add it to your cart. We also have links to the student and instructor guides as well. I'm excited to see what you think about this course. I'm excited to see what you think about Boldmethod AI. And I will see you in our next video where we fly the ILS to runway 11 in San Luis Obispo.